The UN is appealing for a record $51.5 billion for next year. It says that's what's needed to support 230 million of the most vulnerable people across the planet. So what's driving up this need for aid? Which crises take priority? And can the world afford to donate 25% more in 2023? I'm Melinda Nusafora, and today's newsmaker is the UN appeal. The number of people who need humanitarian assistance has never been higher. This year, the conflict in Ukraine, the climate crisis and health epidemics, including cholera and COVID-19, have caused record levels of hunger and unprecedented levels of displacement. The United Nations estimates those crises have long-term implications, causing long-term problems. The UN has described the level of need as shockingly high and says for people on the brink, this appeal is a lifeline. So let's take a look at who some of these people are.
By next year, a record 339 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection. That's 1 in every 23 people on the planet. And the UN aims to assist 230 million people most in need, across 68 countries. The organization says at least 222 million people in 53 countries will be facing food insecurity by the end of this year. And that starvation is going to be a real threat for 45 million people in 37 countries. The Horn of Africa is in the grips of the worst drought in 40 years. Almost 36 million people have been affected. And in Somalia, nearly 8 million people are facing a severe hunger crisis. That's almost half the population of the country.
Commodity prices have almost doubled in Somalia, and in some parts 93% high. The humanitarian appeal for Somalia is only 15% funded. So what we need now is money. We need the cash to avert the risk of famine.
The UN is asking for a record $51.5 billion for its 2023 humanitarian response, the largest appeal for aid funding in its history.
As humanitarian needs shatter records in 2023, so too will the extremely high price tag that follows. But global funding just isn't keeping pace. Donations have actually grown steadily over the past decade, but not as quickly as demand has increased. And it can't keep pace with the rising cost of aid itself. In 2022, the UN received about half the money it needed. Next year, it expects to get only 40% of its required budget. Humanitarian funding for the UN is voluntary and relies overwhelmingly on Western donations. The United States is by far the biggest single donor, contributing about 22% of the annual intake, while European Union countries collectively contribute about 30%. The EU ambassador to the UN says the donor base is disturbingly narrow and needs to be expanded. Providing support during climate-related disasters is hugely expensive, and IMF chief Kristalina Georgieva says government donations just aren't going to cut it anymore.
You talked about the financing gap. We would never close it if we rely on the generosity of rich countries, because it is too big to be closed with public money. So, most important here and in the months to follow is to work relentlessly to create opportunities for private investments to take place in the developing world.
In February this year, Russia launched its so-called special military operation in Ukraine. Almost immediately, there was a need to provide humanitarian assistance as millions of people fled for safety. Almost 10 months on, generous aid donations are continuing to pour into the country, and people are starting to question where those funds have been diverted from. The UN itself said the outpouring for Ukraine was amongst the most generous response to a humanitarian flash appeal it's ever received. And that sits in stark contrast to countries like Yemen, where donors raise less than a third of the required total. 10 countries have appeals exceeding well over $1 billion, including Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen and Ethiopia. Yet one country on that list, Ukraine, is likely to receive the lion's share of aid in 2023.
We've provided assistance of 13.6 million people in Ukraine. And of course, as you know, going into the winter, this ain't getting any easier or less. And Ukraine's proposed budget, our proposed budget for Ukraine next year, I think is the highest of the list. It's $5.1 billion for Ukraine and the region.
As we've just been hearing, funds are stretched to the limit. But are agencies using the funds they have available wisely? To discuss this, I'm joined from Kabul by Richard Trenchard. He is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization representative in Afghanistan. From Nairobi is Margret Mueller, Oxfam International's Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for Horn, East and Central Africa. And from Lagos is Olumide Idowu, the Executive Coordinator of the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. Thank you all for your time. Richard, let me start with you. So how do humanitarian actors like the UN decide where these donations go? How do they prioritise which crisis gets the most and which don't make the cut?
Okay, well, around the world, there's a large number of countries facing crises. And in each of these, very similar methodologies, very similar approaches are followed. Firstly, humanitarian actors, so that's the United Nations, but also it's the incredible international and national and local NGOs who form the humanitarian community, come together by sector. They form what are called clusters. There's a number of those covering food security, health, nutrition, education, water sanitation, etc. They come together and they gather the evidence on what is the crisis situation, and there's a lot of surveys and assessments done with people to really understand who the people are in need, what the crisis is like, what the impact of those crises are, and then to work out how we can best support as an international and national community those people facing acute emergency or humanitarian needs. And in various crisis countries around the world, such as Afghanistan, but also Yemen, Syria, the Horn of African countries, Somalia and the like, then what's called as a humanitarian requirement response plan, which lays out the requirement by sector, is prepared. As I say, very much standardized methodology so that donors can compare, they can make the smart choices. Our job as a humanitarian community is to do the best possible information gathering that we can to really paint an accurate picture of the crisis, identify the people most at need, and then it's for the donors to decide what their priorities are.
Margret, the UN has said that the budget for Ukraine is likely to be on top of the list for next year. As an Oxfam representative, do you agree with that prioritisation? I mean, there's no doubt there is need there, but is it perhaps getting more funding than perhaps other more urgent emergencies?
As a humanitarian community, thank you very much for the question first. As a humanitarian community, we have very clear indicators for what are humanitarian needs. When do we perceive a community not able to sustain their survival and dignity? And when are the governments where these people live not able to sustain their survival? So when we then, as my colleague just described, form a humanitarian plan based on what do we see as urgent needs to support the communities to survive in dignity, that is then based on these indicators that are the minimum standards for survival, really not luxury standards. And yes, it has put a huge strain on the humanitarian community that on top of the many crises that we have, and also the increase, for example, in hunger globally that we have, we also have the crisis in the Ukraine that has put a strain on us. It has put a strain on our capacities as organizations, but also our budgets. But what we say is we see a huge increased solidarity, for example, as Europeans, and it's not either or, it's an and. We can extend solidarity and supporting communities in need, both in the Ukraine and, for example, Afghanistan, West Africa, East Africa. It shouldn't be an either or. People are in need in a lot at the moment. That's the rough reality.
Olumide, does that ring true to you as someone who works directly with African youth, especially around climate change? Is it an either or are you feeling that the focus on aid for Ukraine is eroding perhaps some of the assistance that may have been directed towards emergencies in your continent?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to raise the... Can you hear me very well? I just want to say that most especially when you look at Africa as a continent, the major issue here is how do we build investment opportunity in people? Because a lot of people are talking about the Ukraine war, a lot of people are talking about the crisis that is going on and the food shortage. But the major issue here is how we put our food on their table. Because creating an investment opportunity in the younger generation, it is what they need to have as a conversation now. Nobody is looking at what is happening over there, but the local people that is suffering from this problem, they are seeking for, for the change they need from their government. So for me, I think numbers, ideas, opportunities have been talked about, but the local problem now is how do we turn that to investment opportunity for people that are the receiving end? It is very good that funding is coming from everywhere, but how will this fund actually get to the people that need the funds? Because finance is very, very key in developmental issues. And when you see the economy of Africa, we keep seeking for more money, but is that money getting to the people? We keep talking about there's shortage of food. How much of this food is being produced by small-scale farmers or small-scale older farmers that are actually the one giving the food to the people? So it is not a conversation of where should the money go to. It's about how do we make sure that that food or that money gets to the right people.
Richard, let's put that to you to respond directly to what Olumide has just asked. You work directly with food and agriculture on behalf of the UN. Is the money and the aid that is provided being used effectively? Is it reaching the people that need it the most? Or could we do things perhaps a little bit differently? Do we need to tailor our response for 2023?
I think there's a number of points, and it's a really good, important question, and I think Olumide has described it incredibly well. This year alone in Afghanistan, which actually is the largest appeal for next year, with a total appeal of about 4.6 billion, which is a bit more than the appeal for Syria, for Yemen, and also for Ukraine. FAO is one of the leading partners working in the food and agriculture sector in terms of producing food. This year alone, we'll reach 9 million people, and next year we'll reach about the same number of people again. That's 9 million people across Afghanistan. That's population is roughly 41 million. We will reach an enormous number, an unprecedented number of people with a range of support. And it's not just FAO. We also have the World Food Programme, as well as their incredible food that they provide. They also do lots and lots of work to build the livelihoods of communities. There's some fantastic national, international NGOs working out here as well. But just FAO, to give you a sense of what we're doing, that's providing farmers with the highest quality seeds that are produced locally in Afghanistan, fertilizer. It's also providing the livestock feed. It's also providing livestock health treatment, vegetables, particularly for women, of course, and for the households, for nutritious food. Also, there's poultry that's being provided. It's once again very much used by women for their families and also for the market. There's a broad range of support being provided to smallholder farmers, exactly as Olumide said.
And is that a bit of a change in practice? Have you kind of gone for more of that grass level approach because you see it's more effective?
I think there's two ways of answering that. One, sadly, the scale is unprecedented, and that's because the depth of crisis is unprecedented too. So the big change last year, 2021, which also was a year of drought. There was the crisis in the second half of the year, the economic crisis as well, which compounded the drought. We reached about 3 million people. This year, it'll be 8-9 million people. So firstly, it's the scale. Secondly, yes, there has been an enormous amount of work in the international and the national aid community to make sure that rather than just providing standardized responses, we actually really try to tailor those to different communities, the most people who are most at risk. People obviously living in the mountains may not have so much cropland, but they will have more livestock. Women face particular challenges, really making sure that we really reach them. It's not just FAO, it's the whole aid community. The last 10, 20 years, there's been an enormous amount of effort to both improve the type of support that's been given. Cash has become much more important. And also, there's a process that we call that's critically important called localization. That's really to make sure that it's not just the big international players. You have a critical role to play, but also it's the local, it's the national, it's the community groups also are increasingly involved in identification and the delivery of that assistance.
Margret, there is obviously a funding gap. There is a funding gap every year, unfortunately. But do you think there could be a change in the way aid funding is delivered? Does there need to be more of a focus on emergency mitigation as opposed to just an emergency response? Say, once it's declared a famine, then we inject all the funds. Should we be looking at the countries that are inching towards it?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question that really bothers us strongly because we are very bound to being reactive much more than we would like to. We would like to have much more funding before crises and horrible images hit the media. And we would like to be able, we see, for example, in East Africa, we saw 2 years ago already that there are the warning signs of an incredible drought coming. We saw the crises coming. Lots of crises that are slow onsets, like droughts and so on, are predictable. So what we need to do is to prevent these communities and prevent them from getting into this drought and to increase their resilience.
And how do you do that?
For example, if we invest in a community by digging a borehole for 5,000 people, that costs us one time 300,000 euros. It's expensive. But then they will have support to their livestock throughout the drought. They will have water. And we won't have to support them then when their livestock have died and when they become refugees and they then become aid dependent. And they will rely on external resistance. They will rely on external support on the long term. It is in a way, it is also cheaper for us as an international community to support communities to be strong enough to deal with crises. But that means that we need to invest in long-term support outside of, let's say, alarming media images. And what we see at the moment is that we got in so many places in the world, we got to alarming crisis levels that are so huge. We have hunger in East Africa, in West Africa, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, to levels. We have poverty as a result of economic shocks, COVID-19, and very strongly climate change. These countries that have not contributed to climate change, which is largely the G20 nations that have contributed to 80%, for example, of carbon emissions, but the countries that are suffering from it are those that haven't contributed to it.
Olumide, I want to ask you, as Margret is talking about climate change there, you deal with climate change directly through your agency. Do you think that humanitarian organisations, humanitarian actors have sufficiently adapted to react to this absolutely integral interplay now between climate change and humanitarian need?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think my friend, my colleague there have actually raised a very big point, connecting climate change to this conversation. I would say that there's nothing you want to discuss now in the present age that you will not talk about the climate change, because climate change has been a very big conversation now. It's interlinked to whether it's humanitarian. If you look at it, looking back to 2020 during COVID-19, there's a lot of conversation around how is climate change affecting or how is it reducing the air quality. But the bottom line here is the work of the humanitarian and the work of climate is not something that we can take apart. Why? Because when you look at a country like in Nigeria, in the northern part of the country, we have a lot of humanitarian issues. We have people that need urgent need for food, urgent need for shelters. But the bottom line is it shows that the environment is not conducive. And because it's the climate, it's the space. And if you look at it very well, we have the flood issue. 12 years ago, the same place was flooded. And we are in 2022, we are still talking about that same issue. And it has taken more than 300 to 600 people's lives. So there's no how you want to, separate the conversation of climate change from humanitarian conversation. And that is why you see that the conversation of adaptation, mitigation, climate finance is coming in every time you talk about economic development, you talk about energy transition, you talk about national determined contribution. There is no how you can take this conversation out of them. And that is why you see in the IDP camps in the northern part of the country, we see that the more you are providing basic amenities, the more you need to give them understanding of how to make their environment more conducive. So it is something that we need to continue to emphasize so that there is going to be more financing to drive adaptation and mitigation. Because without financing, there is no how these people that are the receiving end can get a proper humanitarian care. And humanitarian care is not cheap. It's expensive because you're not taking care of just one person. You're not taking care of just two people. You are taking care of a family. And that is why the conversation of climate change is a big conversation. And if we don't take time, it's like a time bomb. It can explode anytime. When I am just giving an instance, it can explode anytime. And that's why you see when the flood happens, people were running scatter. Market women, pregnant women, schools, children cannot go to school. A lot of people were, displaced from their right, from their land, and from their spaces. And where they are taking them to, there's no guarantee of security for them.
Exactly.
So
it is a difficult
climate
situation.
Or climate change.
Richard,
exactly. You can't separate them. They need to work hand in hand.
Yeah, it is a very strong point. And Richard, I want to ask you. You have been working with the UN for a long time now. This is not a new field, talking about humanitarian assistance. Are you seeing more of an interplay with climate change discussions and humanitarian aid? Are they working together, or could we do it better?
So, yeah, as you say, and looking at my hair, I've been in this business for many, many years, and there's absolutely no doubt that in the 25 plus years that I've been working in this field, we've seen an increasing and accelerating impact of climate change. We see the increasing intensity, the increasing frequency of extreme weather events, whether it's droughts, whether it's winters, whether it's floods, etc. So there's no doubt that we are seeing the drumbeat of climate change is beating ever faster and ever louder. Secondly, it's not me to answer your question. Last week, I was in two provinces in Afghanistan, just to the west and north of Kabul, Maidan Wardok, a lot of wheat, a lot of potatoes, also a lot of orchards, and also then up in Bamyan, more mountainous, but also a lot of wheat and a lot of livestock. The farmers are telling you about the impact of climate change. They know that, yes, increasing population pressure, more livestock, longer, hotter winter summers, less snow, which is vital here for irrigation, etc., etc. They know it's happening. They see it's happening. The floods that have hit their community that I was in 3 times in the last 3 years, in summer, they've had them only once before in the last 20 years. So they know what's needed. The support that they're asking us for is both immediate emergency humanitarian assistance. They need that. They've lost their crops, they've lost their incomes, but also it's them that are asking for support to stabilize the hillsides, to regenerate the hillsides, to help them better use those hillsides for livestock pasture. They're asking us to support you can never control floods, but you can manage floods. That's what they're asking us for. And exactly as Olumide has just said, and also Margaret, it's the longer term environmental work that's also required. The picture is not so bleak. It's not as bleak as it was a few years ago. Without doubt, there's been a lot more finance coming into environmental support, and also in protracted crises like here, like in the Horn of Africa and West Africa as well, we are seeing that different types of funding are still being provided at the same time. A few years ago, it was development funding, shock happened, then it was humanitarian, and now we see, even in Afghanistan, with the enormous humanitarian needs here, my agency, like others, we also have work that's still ongoing, looking at longer term climate solutions. It's a small fraction, but also other work looking to try and build those pathways, those more sustainable pathways, that green future, that food future forward. So the situation, it's not perfect, but there's definitely progress. There's a lot more that needs to be done.
There is always so much more that needs to be done, and it is obviously going to be a topic we continue looking at here on TRT World. I wish I could continue discussing it with you all, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your company here and your expertise on the newsmakers. And thank you all for watching. You can follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Melinda Nusafora. We'll see you next time.